Hi there, everyone. This is Lily from Je t'aime me neither. I'm having a little technical difficulty. My original link is not working, so I'm going to try to give another one. So my apologies for this delay, and I'm going to get the new link up shortly. So just bear with me for a second. I think there are a lot of people online right now, and so there are some delays. So I'm going to give you the new link, and we will take it from there. So just give me a little second here. All right, here it is. So, so here, there we go, new link. So hopefully this will still be good and you will enjoy that. So there we go. Here we go. So hopefully this will still be good and you will enjoy that. There we go. There we go. So hopefully this will still be good and you will enjoy that. So I apologize for the little delay and getting started. I'm still a little new at some of this, and so I hope that you will find the link, and I'm just putting it in here. So I'm going to get started, and hopefully this will save, and hopefully you will enjoy this week's story. So it's a great story taking place in the Palais-Royal. So here we go. The story is called In Search of Lost Time at the Palais-Royal and the Galerie Vivienne. Although it changed slightly depending on the time of year, the colonnade's series of repeating shadows always slanted in the same direction in the morning. This was how Capucine preferred to see this sight, she'd taken in daily for the last 30-odd years. Well, almost daily. If it were raining cats and dogs, she'd forgo her daily ritual. And there were those few short holidays she and Robert had taken, once to the Côte d'Azur, too hot, and another to Belgium, too cold. And well, all those months at the hospital. But she didn't like to think about them. It took exactly 262 steps to get there. One day she counted. 262 steps from the door of her apartment down the stairs. Luckily, she only lived on the second floor. Along Rue de la Banque, to the right into the Galerie Vivienne, then left to reach Rue Croix des Petits Champs. She'd have to wait for a gap in the steady stream of traffic to cross, so she could then enter the hidden Passage des Deux Pavillons, go down its set of steps, across the Rue du Beaujolais, always empty, and then through the open iron gate, minding the little step, worn down in a gentle curve after centuries of foot traffic. A further 8 steps would take her to the Galerie Beaujolais, the northernmost covered walkway of the Palais-Royal. On a grey day, the play of light was less remarkable. However, the soft sunlight of this late September morning created a domino-like effect, descending the length of the arcade. However, just because she'd entered le Jardin du Palais-Royal, it didn't mean she'd arrived at her final destination. She still had 27 more steps to go. Originally built for Cardinal Richelieu in the 1630s, the Palais-Royal was expanded over the years, especially in the late 1700s when its gardens were boxed in by buildings and those covered walkways. Visiting the tranquil gardens today, one could hardly imagine that it was once the lively center of Parisian shopping and entertainment. Hit by the sun's rays, Capucine squinted as she stepped into the enclosed gardens. After some initial trial and error, she'd come to the conclusion that 11 a.m. was the perfect time of day to come. This would spare her the lunchtime sandwich eaters, the squealing kids racing about after school, and the apéro hour pétanque players. The only time of year when the park was uncharacteristically busy in the morning was late winter, when the magnolia blossoms popped out. But this was a relatively new phenomenon. Not the blossoms, but in recent years, during that 2-week period, she'd noticed a considerable upswing in people. Fancy smartphones in hand, taking an absurd amount of photos. She didn't really understand what the fuss was all about. When the subject had come up last year during one of the few conversations she had with fellow parkgoers, apparently those thousands of photos went onto a thing called Instagram or something like that. Anyway, the oohing and awing photographers usually flooded the park in the afternoon, so she wasn't all that bothered by this brief invasion. Almost at her destination, Capucine froze on the fifth to last step. There was something seriously wrong. There was someone on her bench. She stood there, as rigid as the manicured trees which lined the garden. Her already squinting eyes were reduced to tiny arrow-hole slits through which she was launching a barrage of poisonous evil eyes. Her defensive efforts seemed to have no effect whatsoever on the abominable invader. After what seemed like an eternity, the intruder noticed Capucine. "Bonjour, madame," he greeted cheerfully. Capucine intensified her war stance. "Would you like to take a seat?" suggested the young man, looking over at the other side of the bench. It was clear there was ample room on it for this little old lady. Nevertheless, he slid over to the edge of the bench and made a Vanna White arm gesture, matched with an equally gleaming smile, over at the 5 feet of bench which was still available for her. Capucine didn't budge. "What a lovely day," he said as he loudly inhaled the crisp morning air. "The park is splendid in autumn, don't you think?" No, thought Capucine. It wasn't splendid at all with this obtrusive man on her bench. "I almost prefer the park at this time of year," he continued. "I have to say, springtime is also nice. However, in the past few years, the magnolia blossoms have been attracting way too many people." "I couldn't agree more." The statement hopped out of her mouth before she could realize what had happened. She couldn't consort with the enemy. "What's the point of taking all those photos when you can sit here on this lovely bench and simply savor their beauty?" he said with another wave of his arm, this time up in the air from his seated vantage point. Capucine couldn't help but follow his gesture up towards those magnolia branches. It was true, her bench was perfectly positioned to enjoy them, in addition to the whole north end of the park. Capucine scrunched up her toes and shifted her stance. Even if she was going just to the park, Capucine still wore her pumps. She was only meant to walk 262 steps. Then she would be sitting down. Standing on these uneven pebbles was not part of her usual routine. Have you noticed that the leaves on the chestnut trees are starting to turn? He went on, pointing up at the branches, seemingly oblivious to Capucine's displeasure and discomfort. She turned around to check, but with her bad knees, she wasn't able to crouch down to get the right angle. She had no choice but to sit down on the bench so she could see what he was referring to. No, those aren't chestnut trees. They're lindens, she corrected. Oh, thank you, he said without putting any attention to the fact that Capucine had finally sat down next to him. I grew up in an apartment, so I don't know my trees very well. So did I, but it's just something you can learn, she said curtly. Yes, that's true, he replied thoughtfully. Like the saying goes, we can learn something new every day. I suppose so, but when you've surpassed 80, those little details don't seem to matter much anymore. 80? But, Madame, you don't look a day over 65, he proclaimed sincerely. She pretended not to be flattered. However, her glacial frown was defrosting, and her dagger eyes had retreated. My name's Luca. He took the liberty of introducing himself with an outstretched hand. Capucine stared at it for a minute before shaking it with the very tips of her fingers. Luca? She questioned. I assumed your name would be different. Born and raised in la région parisienne, Madame. Madame Dubois. Madame Dubois, enchantée. It's a pleasure to meet you. Well, at least he had good manners, Capucine thought to herself. Do you work at a restaurant around here or something? She asked, nodding her head in the direction of the 2 Michelin-starred establishments on the north side of the Palais-Royal. No, I'm quite fond of Le Grand Vefour, but I don't work in the restaurant business, replied Luca, unfazed by her presumptuous question. I actually run a bookshop. You run a bookshop? She said, surprised, yet trying not to seem too interested. Yes, it's nearby. I needed some fresh air, so I came to the park for a little break. Which bookshop? She quizzed. I've lived in Le Quartier since long before you were born, in la région parisienne. You surely know it then, replied Luca. À la recherche du temps perdu, the bookshop at the end of the Galerie Vivienne. À la recherche du temps perdu, she said, taken aback. Yes, I know it. Very well, she added after a moment of silence, turning her gaze back to the garden. In search of lost time. That's what Capucine now spent most of her days doing. It had been hard losing Robert. They'd been married for 51 years. Even though he hadn't been overly affectionate, he was a good man. He'd spent his whole career working at the Central Post Office, a colossal building located a few blocks away. As a fonctionnaire, a French civil servant, he'd been able to secure them an HLM, an habitation à loyer modéré, a state-sponsored apartment with low rent. Otherwise, they would never have been able to afford to live where they did, right in the center of the city. They'd had a simple yet happy life. They had two kids, a boy and a girl. They were good students. They went to university, got jobs, moved out, got married, got on with their lives. After the kids had moved out, although Capucine still had the household to manage and meals to prepare, she suddenly had a lot more time on her hands. She ended up occupying these extra hours with reading, a new passion which came about rather by accident. She usually did her errands along La Rue Croix des Petits Champs, where one could find the local bakery, greengrocers, the butchers, and other small shops. To get there, she would always take the shortcut through the Galerie Vivienne, almost the same route she would later take to the Palais-Royal. However, one morning, it must have been in 1988 or 89, she had an appointment close to the Opera Garnier. So instead of turning left down the main section of the Galerie Vivienne, she turned right. Admittedly, she knew there were some other stores at the far end of the historic shopping arcade, but since she rarely went that direction, she'd hardly given them any notice. As she reached the end of the passage and descended the small staircase, her purse caught something, resulting in a loud clatter behind her. Whirling around, Capucine was mortified to see a dozen or so books spewed across the gallery's beautiful mosaic tiled floor. "Oh, mon Dieu," she exclaimed, bending down to pick up the books. "Please don't trouble yourself," called a man's voice from inside the shop. "Let me get those." In an instant, the owner of the voice had swooped down to collect the fallen books. As she looked up, Capucine's gaze met a set of piercing blue eyes, hovering a mere few inches from her own. "I'm terribly sorry," said Capucine, her cheeks flaring as she hopped up and turned away in an attempt to mask her embarrassment. "If I damaged any of the books, I would happily pay for them." "Oh, there won't be any need for that, madame," he assured her. "These books are used and have already been knocked about a good deal during their lifetime. They only cost a few francs each, but the entertainment they provide is priceless," he tacked on. Capucine dared let her eyes meander over the stack of books in his hands. The title, Au Bonheur des Dames, jumped out at her. "Ah, classic Zola," enthused the bookseller, noticing her shifting gaze to the cover of The Lady's Delight. "How much is it?" she asked. 8 francs, he replied, upon checking the amount written in pencil inside the front cover. Capucine rummaged through her handbag. She pulled out her change purse, but was dismayed to find that it contained only a few centimes. "I'm afraid I only have large notes, but I live nearby. I'll come back another time for the book." "Please take it now," he pressed, forcing the book into her hands. "Someone else might have bought it before you return. You can pay for it next time you're passing by. But, I insist." "Oh, that's very kind of you, Mr. Swan," he answered. Very well, Mr. Swan. À très bientôt, she said, then gave a courteous nod and carried on her way. With pleasure, madame, with pleasure, he called after her. That very afternoon, Capucine dove into the book. The hours flew by as she devoured Zola's prose. It took the fading afternoon light to start her out of her literary trance. Robert would be home soon. She'd better get down to making dinner. The time-consuming boeuf bourguignon she'd intended to make would have to wait for another night. The next day, she couldn't resist returning to the book, but immediately felt guilty. I should really go and pay Mr. Swan for it, she thought. Capucine didn't like having debts. Before sliding on her coat and pumps, she found herself in front of her dressing table, applying some lipstick, sprucing up her hair, and spritzing a dash of perfume. Was this really necessary to go around the block to a bookstore? She caught herself out. Well, it never hurts to be at one's best. Capucine couldn't explain it, but her heart rate quickened as she walked under the passage's glass roof in the direction of the shop. Yesterday, she'd been too flustered to see what it was called, so when she arrived in front of the shop, she craned her neck up at the sign. À la recherche du temps perdu. Even someone not terribly literarily minded like herself knew the title of Marcel Proust's epic 7-volume saga, obviously the inspiration for the shop's name. The little tinkle of the bells hanging on the door handle announced Capucine's arrival. Ah, bonjour, madame, Mr. Swan greeted, raising his head from a book. How nice to see you again so soon, Capucine blushed. She glanced around the shop in an effort to avoid Mr. Swan's sparkling eyes. All around her were hundreds, if not thousands, of books. The ones that lined the upper cases had worn leather spines. These must be the more precious ones. Whereas on the tables and in the bins were the used modern paperbacks. I hope you are enjoying the Zola, he said, regaining Capucine's attention. Oh yes, it's an excellent book, which I must duly pay you for, she said. She pulled out her change purse and placed precisely 8 francs on the counter. Thank you for your promptness, he said, putting the money in the till. Isn't it a lovely day? Why, yes. Now that you mention it, spring is decidedly in the air, replied Capucine, trying to remain formal. You could take your book to the park, suggested Mr. Swan. That isn't such a bad idea, pondered Capucine. Le Jardin du Palais-Royal was so close, yet she hadn't spent much time there since the children were little. Tucked away within those buildings, it was so quiet, plus it had plenty of benches. It was the ideal setting to read in peace while enjoying the balmy weather. Be sure to come back when you need a new book, madame. Mr. Swanson's sentence trailed off, fishing for her name. Madame Dubois. Happy reading, Madame Dubois. And so began Capucine's daily trips to Le Palais-Royal. She always went at 11 a.m. and always sat on the same bench, one which she had carefully staked out. While Robert was still working, These outings were reserved for Monday to Friday. However, when he retired, she added on the weekend. Her Sunday sessions only shortened if the kids were coming over for lunch. Her voracious new appetite for literature needed to be fed, and Capucine could be found at least once a week at La Recherche du Temps Perdu. She continued to remain cordial and formal to Mr. Swan. However, her fondness for him was growing with the rapidly expanding collection of books. Of course, this crush was ridiculous. She was a married woman. She loved Robert and was entirely loyal. Nevertheless, it was not with him that she could debate Camus. Mr. Swan had first turned her to literature and then succeeded in broadening her scope. After a few years, Capucine slowly left behind Hugo, Sand, and Flaubert to enter the 20th century. With all the time you're spending in the Palais-Royal, it's really high time you read some Colette, declared Mr. Swan many years later. Why is that? The writer lived at Le Palais-Royal, I think in the 1920s, Mr. Swan elaborated. She wrote about it in her book, Trois, Six, Neuf. Do you have it in stock? Let me take a look, he said, scanning his tables. By now, Capucine knew how the shop's collections were organized, but she secretly loved how Mr. Swan's face transformed as he concentrated, brow furrowed, on searching for a particular title. You're in luck, he beamed, producing a worn book with curled page corners. 6-9. 6-9. These numbers brought no luck to Capucine. When she turned 69, her husband, then 72, was diagnosed with cancer. Despite his prognosis, he remained upbeat. It was now the 21st century. They had fancy new treatments these days. The doctors would surely be able to help him. And they did, for a time. Naturally, Robert's health concerns caused Capucine to put her hobby on hold. When Robert went into remission after his first chemo treatments, he seemed strong enough for Capucine to have some time for herself. Nonetheless, she couldn't bear to go to the bookshop. Not now. Robert's condition did not improve for long. Within 8 months, he was admitted to the hospital. Read to me, murmured Robert after they'd spent the first few days in painful silence, save for the regular visits of the overly perky nurses. Pardon? Capucine asked, puzzled by his request. Read to me, he said, raising his voice to a more audible level. Why don't you read me one of those books you always have your nose in? And so they spent the next 5 weeks in the company of the Count of Monte Cristo, Le Père Goriot, and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Robert took his last breaths during Les Miserables. Capucine by his side, like Cosette was to Jean Valjean. One day, in the weeks that followed, Capucine found a small, thick package in her mailbox. She carefully opened it, and a book with a folded letter slid out. Une pensée pour vous, a little thought for you. Signed C. Swan. She turned over the book to read its title, Voyage au bout de la nuit. Journey to the End of the Night by Celine. News of Robert's passing must have spread around the quartier. Although it had never been discussed, she was quite sure she'd caught Mr. Swan looking down at her left hand on one of the first visits to the shop. He therefore knew she was married and never made any advances, despite the spark that continued between them. She was touched by his thoughtful gesture, but she was not ready to fill her heart with her favorite pleasure, anything or anyone else, just yet. Madame Dubois, it's been ages, exclaimed Mr. Swan when he looked up to find Capucine at the door of his shop. I've been worried about you. Almost a year had gone by since Robert's diagnosis and that last visit to the shop. Although she was in finished mourning, she had finally got around to Mr. Swan's touching gift, which reignited her desire to read. This didn't mean that she was completely ready to go back to living. She took her time. Now and then, Mr. Swan's passionate descriptions of the book he was imploring her to read brought a look of joy to Capucine's face. On another visit, she even laughed. The two of them seemed to be getting closer and closer. However, as the years passed, neither took that extra step in the other's direction. No invitation for lunch or coffee. No suggestion to meet up at her bench in the Palais-Royal. Mr. Swan is missed by many, Capucine eventually managed after several minutes staring at the linden trees. Yes, he was a very fine man, said Luca. His sudden disappearance was a shock to us all. The worst was not being able to say goodbye, added Capucine, somewhat misty-eyed. You know, I think I remember seeing you in the shop once, said Luca. Oh, really? She answered dubiously. I did a 3-month internship with Mr. Swan during my master's, explained Luca. Oh, must have been 5 or 6 years ago. My uncle was a Tunisian poet, so I had started doing my dissertation on poetry. However, during the course of my time at the shop, Mr. Swan slyly converted me to 20th century French literature. I would spend my mornings at the library and come to the bookshop in the afternoons. One day I arrived early, actually around this time of day. Mr. Swan was so enraptured in conversation that he didn't even notice me come in. He was talking to a smartly dressed woman, about your height, who was holding a copy of Marguerite Duras, The Lover. The memory hit Capucine as hard as Quasimodo ringing the bells of Notre Dame. Yes, at one point, around 5 years ago, he had tried to drop stronger hints of his admiration. This was done in true Mr. Swan style, through a series of romantic book suggestions, which culminated in Duras' The Lover. Mr. Swan had just finished a fervent introduction to the book and was about to say something else, something that seemed important to him, when he was interrupted by a cough coming from the direction of the shop's entrance. Mr. Swan and Capucine swung around to find a young man standing meekly at the door, and the moment was lost forever. Capucine was indeed terribly fond of Mr. Swan, but she really didn't know how to handle the situation. She didn't know if she was capable of loving him, of loving anybody but Robert. So she avoided the shop for a few weeks, and when she did return, Mr. Swan pretended as if nothing had ever happened. My internship was how I originally got to know Mr. Swan and fall in love with his shop, said Luca. It's good to know his memory and his shop will live on through you, said Capucine. You seem like a fine young man, she added. The hostility she unrightfully displayed at the beginning of their encounter had vanished. I will do my best, he pledged. The shop has stayed pretty much the same, but I've expanded with some nonfiction and some art books. We've just received a great new release on women artists of the 19th century, in case the topic could be of interest. No, but thanks anyway. I'll stick to literature. Well, we definitely have plenty of that, so I expect to see you soon at the shop. Capucine gazed around the park. Maybe the leaves on the linden trees were turning. She thought about the 262 steps it took to get here, and the 184 steps it took to get to the shop. She had spent too much precious energy these past years and these past months in search of lost time. She could not rewrite volumes of her life, but she could turn over a new page. With pleasure, Luca, with pleasure. So I hope you liked this story, a little bit different from the others, and I think we'll be able to create a wonderful next story together. As I mentioned, it is going to be on Notre Dame in honor of the 1 year anniversary of the cathedral's fire. So please look out for that next week, and I hope to see you here for There's Only One Paris. Thanks again.